John Wayne and Marlon Brando were two of the most influential figures in 20th century American film, but they represented opposite visions of Hollywood, performance, and public identity. John Wayne became the defining face of the traditional Western hero, rugged, unwavering, patriotic, and loyal to the myth of the frontier. His screen image aligned closely with his role-life beliefs. He valued structure, national pride, and the idea that America's image should be projected as confident and morally justified. He did not separate the heroism of his characters from the values he defended in interviews and public speeches. Wayne believed film carried a responsibility to reinforce the identity of the nation as strong, righteous, and uncompromising. Marlon Brando emerged with a completely different presence. Trained in method acting and influenced by psychological realism, Brando approached performance as emotional truth rather than posture. His breakthrough roles in A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951, and On the Waterfront, 1954, introduced a new kind of intimacy in acting, internal, vulnerable, and grounded in real human conflict rather than mythic ideals. Brando viewed cinema as an opportunity to reveal contradictions in society rather than reinforce comforting narratives. He became associated with a growing cultural movement that questioned authority, traditional institutions, and inherited national narratives. By the 1950s and 1960s, these two men had become symbolic opposites during a time when the United States was undergoing social and ideological change. Civil rights activism, anti-war sentiment, and generational shifts in identity were reshaping the cultural landscape. Hollywood reflected this divide. Some continued to tell traditional American stories emphasizing triumph, frontier expansion, and moral certainty. Others gravitated toward realism, ambiguity, and critique. Wayne became the most recognizable face of the earlier era. Brando became the most recognizable face of the changing one. John Wayne valued cinema as a cultural tool. He believed westerns and war films promoted patriotism and national unity. To him, criticism of America's past or military action represented not artistic complexity but disrespect. He viewed the idea of questioning national myths as weakening the country. Marlon Brando, by contrast, believed film had a responsibility to confront uncomfortable truths. He saw performance not as symbolic reassurance, but as a way to expose injustice, inequality, and emotional struggle. He viewed cinema as a medium that should evolve with society rather than preserve outdated narratives. Their disagreement began as differing artistic philosophies but grew intense as politics entered the discussion. Brando spoke openly about racial injustice, indigenous representation, and the moral consequences of U.S. foreign involvement. He supported social reform movements and aligned with organizations calling for systemic change. Wayne publicly rejected these positions. In interviews, he dismissed Brando's activism as misguided and damaging to American unity. He viewed Brando's criticism of Hollywood portrayal of groups such as Native Americans as an attack on the Western genre itself. Wayne believed these criticisms undermined the stories that had shaped American identity. By the late 1960s, their conflict represented more than two individual opinions. It had become a public symbol of Hollywood's divide. Brando continued to challenge the industry to acknowledge the harm caused by stereotyped representation and exclusion of marginalized voices. Wayne continued to defend the older system where he saw honor in tradition and continuity. They rarely spoke directly to each other, but their statements in interviews and articles made it clear that the disagreement was both personal and ideological. Colleagues in the industry often found themselves aligned with one side or the other. Directors, writers, and actors who emphasized realism, political engagement, and emotional vulnerability gravitated toward Brando's example. Those who valued tradition, national pride, and Hollywood's classic storytelling format found their anchor in Wayne. The two men represented opposing cultural identities in a rapidly changing film industry, one rooted in familiar myth, the other in evolving social consciousness. Even without direct confrontation, the contrast between them shaped how Hollywood understood its own purpose. Wayne's presence represented continuity with the past. Brando's presence represented transformation. Their disagreement highlighted the tension between storytelling as reassurance and storytelling as examination. The divide reflected how Americans themselves were debating what the country was, what it had been, and what it should become. The rivalry grew not from personal temperament alone, but from two fundamentally different views about what film should communicate to audiences. Wayne believed cinema should inspire confidence in the nation and uphold established moral frameworks. Brando believed cinema should reveal emotional truth and challenge systems that relied on myth to obscure injustice. Neither man compromised on these core beliefs, and because both dominated public attention, the contrast stood out clearly. By the early 1970s, their ideological opposition became widely recognized and firmly established. Critics, journalists, and scholars reference the divide as a defining example of Hollywood's internal struggle over identity and purpose. The disagreement became a symbol of the broader cultural shift happening across America, making the tension between Wayne and Brando more than professional dispute. It was a reflection of a nation choosing between two stories about itself. The divide between John Wayne and Marlon Brando became unmistakable during the late 1950s and 1960s, as both men became more outspoken about their beliefs. Hollywood was changing, and what once had been a quiet ideological difference began surfacing in interviews, press panels, and industry conversations. Brando increasingly criticized Hollywood's portrayal of marginalized groups, particularly indigenous peoples, while Wayne publicly defended the traditional Western representations that had defined his career. What made their opposition impossible to ignore was that both men had large, loyal followings that saw them not simply as actors, but as cultural representatives. Every statement they made carried weight far beyond film. Wayne believed deeply in the Western myth, the idea that American history could be told through rugged individualism, frontier expansion, and a clear separation of good and evil. He considered these stories essential to national identity. In his view, revising these narratives or questioning the moral framework posed a threat to the unity and pride of the country. Wayne felt strongly that Western celebrated courage, survival, and purpose. For decades, his roles reflected a vision of America that was heroic and morally unambiguous. Brando, in contrast, saw these same stories as incomplete and often misleading. He criticized the romanticization of frontier expansion and the portrayal of indigenous peoples as obstacles or caricatures rather than human beings. Brando believed that Hollywood had contributed to real harm by shaping public understanding through misrepresentation. He argued that film should reflect truth, not myth, especially when myths cause suffering. For Brando, performance and activism were inseparable. He felt that cinema had a responsibility to examine injustice rather than reinforce narratives that justified it. The tension became more visible when Brando took increasingly public stances on civil rights issues. He participated in marches and spoke openly in interviews about systemic racism, discrimination, and the need for reform. Wayne saw this activism as unnecessary, divisive, and harmful to national unity. He believed that criticizing American institutions weakened the country rather than strengthened it. Their disagreement was not superficial. It reflected a fundamental conflict between preserving tradition and confronting historical harm. The conflict reached a defining public moment in 1973 during the Academy Awards. Brando had won Best Actor for his role in The Godfather, but he chose not to attend the ceremony. Instead, he asked Sachin Littlefeather, an indigenous activist, to appear on his behalf. She delivered a brief statement explaining that Brando was refusing the award to protest Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans and the broader pattern of discrimination against them. The moment was unprecedented and immediately polarizing. Wayne was present at the ceremony and reacted strongly. Reports from those backstage indicated that he felt Brando's action was an insult to the industry and to the country. He believed the Oscars should not be used as a platform for political messaging. This incident made their disagreement impossible to frame as merely professional. The difference between them had become a public and symbolic clash over the direction of Hollywood and the meaning of American identity. After the Oscars incident, the divide became entrenched. Wayne continued to defend the values he believed defined America: loyalty, patriotism, and national pride. Brando continued to advocate for representation, accountability, and cultural self-examination. They rarely spoke directly to one another, but their public statements made it clear they viewed each other as representing opposite cultural futures. Wayne considered Brando's criticism of Hollywood an attack on principles he saw as foundational. Brando believed Wayne represented a refusal to acknowledge historical harm. Colleagues in the industry understood that the conflict extended beyond performance style or political opinion. It reflected the broader divide shaping America during the Civil Rights era, the Vietnam War, and the generational shift in values. Directors, Actors and studios were splitting between a Hollywood that wanted to preserve its past and one that wanted to redefine itself. Wayne and Brando became the faces of that split. Their methods of performance also reinforced their differences. Wayne's acting relied on consistency and external presence. His characters projected moral certainty and emotional restraint. Brando's method acting embraced vulnerability, uncertainty, and internal conflict. Wayne believed film should model strength. Brando believed film should reveal complexity. Their disagreement mirrored a deeper artistic debate, whether cinema should reassure or challenge. By the time the 1970s ended, Hollywood itself had changed. New directors, new storytelling methods, and new social awareness reshaped the industry. Brando's influence on acting style became foundational for future generations, while Wayne's films remained cultural symbols of an earlier American narrative. The divide between them was never resolved because it was not based on personal grievance. It was rooted in two incompatible visions of what story should do, what history should mean, and how a nation should see itself. Their conflict became a permanent chapter in film history, not because of hostility, but because it captured the moment when Hollywood had to choose whether to continue telling stories of certainty or begin telling stories of complexity. As time moved forward, the divide between John Wayne and Marlon Brando did not fade. Instead, it settled into history as a defining example of Hollywood's internal struggle of identity, purpose, and representation. Their disagreement was not based on a specific incident alone, but on two opposing visions of what film should communicate to the world. Wayne believed movies were meant to preserve national pride and celebrate American ideals. Brando believed they were meant to interrogate those ideals and expose the realities beneath them. John Wayne maintained his position as one of the key symbols of classic Hollywood. His films continued to reinforce the mythology of the frontier, personal duty, heroism, and the clear division between right and wrong. For decades, audiences connected with the certainty his characters projected. His roles were consistent, defined by resilience and unwavering resolve. Wayne became synonymous with the idea of the American hero, strong, loyal, confident, and morally sure of himself. Even as cultural attitudes shifted, his image remained stable. For many, Wayne represented a comforting, confident past. Marlon Brando, meanwhile, affected acting in a fundamentally different way. His approach to character was built on internal psychology rather than external posture. He changed how actors prepared, how they expressed emotion, and how they responded to their environment. His work influenced an entire generation of performers who followed him. Actors such as Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, and many others built their craft on approaches Brando normalized. The tone of film acting changed permanently because of him. Where Wayne represented consistency and mythic certainty, Brando represented vulnerability and emotional depth. The two legacies stood in stark contrast. Wayne's work maintained an idealized version of American history, while Brando's work revealed the emotional cost of living through it. Wayne shaped the past memory. Brando shaped the future's understanding. Their public conflict also influenced how Hollywood handled activism, representation, and cultural narrative. Brando's decision to refuse the Academy Award marked a turning point. It forced the industry to confront criticism from within, and it demonstrated that actors could challenge the system publicly without being dismissed. His activism helped push film conversation toward accountability, particularly regarding indigenous portrayal and identity. Wayne, reacting against this, embodied the side of Hollywood that viewed criticism as betrayal. The disagreement highlighted a choice that filmmakers still confront, whether to protect established storytelling traditions or to revise them in the interest of accuracy and fairness. Their conflict has lasting implications because it represented a broader cultural divide that extended beyond film. Wayne and Brando were not simply people who acted in movies. They became shorthand for two philosophies. One side valued stability, tradition, and patriotic narrative. The other side valued reform, truth-telling, and acknowledgement of historical harm. This divide still appears in discussions of film, education, politics, and national identity. As both men aged, they remained consistent in their beliefs. Wayne continued to defend the traditional image of America until the end of his life. He did not change his position in response to criticism or shifting attitudes. He believed that the heroic narrative was essential to American unity. Brando continued to challenge Hollywood and public institutions, remaining outspoken about injustice and the need for systemic reform. He did not seek popularity for these positions, and he did not retract them when challenged. Each man's conviction was firm. In the years after their deaths, their legacies developed along parallel but distinct lines. Wayne's films continued to be recognized as a foundational artifact of American cinema, celebrated for their scale, clarity, and cultural impact. Brando's performances remain central to acting craft, studied in universities and conservatories for their psychological realism and emotional power. Film scholars often reference the two actors together because they embody the shift from mythic storytelling to psychological authenticity. The story of their conflict is not about one being right and the other wrong. It is about the reality that Hollywood was changing, moving from one era into another. Wayne held on to the certainty of traditional heroism because he believed it served a purpose. Brando rejected it because he believed truth mattered more than mythology. These positions were not surface-level disagreements. They were rooted in fundamentally different understandings of what art should do. When people say that a Hollywood legend despised John Wayne, it oversimplifies what was actually happening. The divergence was deeper than dislike. It was a collision of two symbolic worlds, one looking back to preserve the past and one looking forward to reshape the future. Their conflict remains relevant because America continues to debate the same questions: how to remember history, how to portray identity, and how storytelling shapes the way people understand themselves. The divide between Wayne and Brando did not end with either of them. It continues to play out in the films Hollywood makes today.